Hello everyone, my name's Hetal. If you haven't met me before, I'm one of the assistant pastors here at Manchester Vineyard, and it's so lovely to have you here with us this morning. So ever since I remember, I've been afraid of heights. I remember going to the pantomime as a child, and we'd be often sitting up in the gallery, which felt really high up. And I remember I had this tactic as a child to try and get as much of my body as physically possible glued to the seat and the floor, so I felt more secure that I wouldn't suddenly tumble down the tiered seating. And this meant there was no ice cream for me during the break because I was too scared to get up and walk along the tiered seating to get any. And as I grew up, my fear of heights remained. I was afraid to go on the Eiffel Tower, the London Eye. I've been afraid to fly, all of it. And at some point in my time at university, I resolved that I was going to overcome my fear of heights. I decided to go rock climbing with my friend who was an instructor. So there we are, I've got all my gear on, my friend has got me roped up, and I'm safe to climb. And I'm standing at the bottom of this huge rock wall, and my arms and legs are like jelly, which is obviously really unhelpful if you need to climb. But I take a deep breath and I start working my way up the wall, forcing myself to look upwards, and I do it. I get all the way up to the top. And I remember feeling so proud of myself. I was beaming until I realised I had to come back down again. What my friend had failed to tell me was that to get back down from the top, you have to abseil down. So you push yourself off the wall and allow your weight to drop you, being carefully aided by your instructor who's manoeuvring the ropes on the floor. Well, it's safe to say I was terrified, and that was reflected in the time it took me to come down the wall. It was a very long time. For each 50 centimetres I descended, it required a 10-minute personal pep talk and huge amounts of encouragement from my friend. And it's safe to say, although the bravery was there, I did not overcome my fear of heights that day. And much to my friend's relief, I have never been rock climbing again. So this morning, we're going to be speaking about the topic of fear and how we overcome it. And by fear, I mean, and so here's a dictionary definition, it's an unpleasant emotion caused by threat of danger, pain, or harm. Applying that to my fear of heights, it's the strong emotional reaction I get when high up due to the threat of injury if I fall. So what we're not talking about is fear as in fear of the Lord, which is a type of fear that we try to cultivate as followers of Jesus. So just to make it clear from the start, we're focusing on fear as an emotional reaction to something that could be dangerous, painful, or harmful. So why is it that we're looking at the topic of fear this morning? Why is overcoming fear such an important part of our discipleship? Well, firstly, because fear is rampant in our society. Fear and anxiety are closely related, with anxiety often finding its source in fear. And if you look at statistics about anxiety, things don't look good. Mind, the mental health charity, research shows that in any given week, around 20% of the population are suffering from an anxiety disorder, which is an incredibly high number. Around a fifth of our population is experiencing fear and anxiety on such a level that it's considered an illness as it's affecting the way that they live day to day. But mental health experts also explain that mental and emotional health is on a spectrum that we're all on somewhere. So it's not a matter of us and them. It's a matter of all of us being on the line somewhere. And statistics show that over 75% of people think the world has become a more frightening place in the last 10 years. And just under 40% of people admit to feeling more afraid and anxious than ever before. Whatever statistics you look at, it seems that fear is becoming an ever-increasing reality in our lives. And the causes of this are multifactorial, whether it's from socioeconomic factors, isolation, 24/7 news coverage that seeks to promote outrage and anxiety, a rise in catastrophic thinking, or an inability to recognise fear and seek help when it's become problematic. It's evident that fear is an increasing reality in all of our lives, not just those suffering from anxiety disorders, but for all of us. The second reason we're looking at fear this morning is because it's important for our discipleship. And we know that because the Bible has a lot to say about it. Do not fear, or phrases to that effect, is the most repeated command in the Bible. For example, as the Israelites stood between the Red Sea and the Egyptians, Moses said to the Israelites, Do not be afraid, stand firm, and you will see the deliverance the Lord will bring you today. Not only that, but Jesus' most repeated command is, do not fear, or phrases to a similar effect too. For example, Jesus tells his followers to not be afraid, as God knows every hair on their head in Luke 12. So it turns out that do not fear is not just a good thing to do to improve the quality of our life, although it of course will help improve our lives. It's also an obedience thing, and therefore it's a discipleship thing. Jesus has us on a journey to become people who are free of fear, people who do not struggle with fear like the world does. So this morning we're going to look at fear because number one, it's an ever-growing problem in our society, in my life and yours. And because number two, it's important for our discipleship, we're repeatedly commanded to not be afraid. So the outline for this morning is we're going to look at the necessity of fear, but also how fear can quickly overstep from its constructive usage and become unhealthy and limiting. We'll then look at the story of Jesus walking on the water in Matthew 14 and draw out a few points about fear and how we can overcome it. So firstly, it's worth noting that fear is an emotion that has been created by God. God created human beings, and in his wisdom, he created us with a range of emotions, and fear is one of those emotions. Fear is a primal emotion God created to maintain life. When our lives are a threat by some sort of danger, then we feel fear. And this fear is meant to prompt us to act. For instance, when a bus is hurtling towards you at 70 miles per hour whilst you're crossing the road, fear kicks in and you run to get out of the way. So fear is incredibly important for our survival. However, in our broken and sinful world, fear has overstepped its mark. No longer is it just an emotion that we respond to promote our survival, but it's an emotion that quickly overcomes us, making us slaves to fear. And this happens in all sorts of ways. Sometimes it's because our thinking has become faulty. We forget that fear is caused by a threat, not an actual reality. For instance, when we're about to do some public speaking, we may experience fear because of the threat of messing up. Public speaking in and of itself is not bad or harmful or painful, you may disagree, but there's the threat that it might go horrendously wrong. However, for many of us, it's all too easy to react in fear at the actual act of public speaking rather than the threat of what could go wrong, which causes our fears to run away with us and overwhelm us. Other times when we're afraid of something, it can trigger us to overthink. We ruminate, catastrophize, go down the worst case scenario route. I'm sure you know what that's like. My husband is late from work leads to, he must have been in an accident, rather than thinking he's just probably stuck in traffic. Or, my child didn't do well in their maths test, leads to, they're going to fail school, drop out and become addicted to drugs. Rather than thinking maybe they just had a bad day or maths just isn't their subject. Often we catastrophize because it relates to a deeper fear that we carry, such as, I'm dumb, I'm not good enough, no one is going to want to listen to me, my kids' failures and successes reflect my self-worth, and so on. And before we know, when we overthink, our fears are magnified and they control us. For others of us, our fears start to control us because we promote our emotions to decision makers. Emotions are really important as they tell us something matters. They tell us that something is worth thinking about. They're meant to trigger analysing and give us a fuller picture to be able to make wise, holistic decisions. However, our emotions, especially fear, can control us when we promote it to decision maker, a role that they're not meant to take. It sounds like this. I'm not going to take that step out in faith or ask that person out or break up with that person or apply for that job or tell that person the truth or be vulnerable or allow my child autonomy or take that risk or make that change because I'm afraid. When we allow emotions to make decisions for us, they can start to control us, and this is particularly true about fear. And then other times, our fears start to control us because we're seeking to find love and satisfaction in worldly things other than God. Our fears often relate to the things we love the most, like our loved ones, our job, our house, our health, our possessions. So our main fears are around losing a loved one, or never getting married or having kids, or not being successful or admired in our job, or having a poor health, or our kids not doing well in school, or not being able to afford a certain lifestyle. These fears are natural, as those things are of value to us. But it's when we allow those things to become more valuable to us than God, then our fears can overwhelm us. When we allow our loved ones, our marital status, our kids, our possessions, our wealth, our health, and success be more important to us than God, then we can spiral into fear. When we trust too much in creation, when we love and long for limited, created things to satisfy us, then our fear overcomes us. Because all of those things are temporary, things of this world. They can never last forever and can easily be lost or never obtained. People die, relationships don't work out, health will inevitably decline, and so on. So if we seek to find our satisfaction in those temporary, insecure things, then we are doomed to a life of fear, because we will never have what we want, and whatever we do have, we'll be afraid to lose. But if we seek to find our satisfaction in God, then our fears dissipate. God, the Creator God, is not temporary. He will last forever. His promises are trustworthy, and his plans for eternity will come to pass. And more than that, God has given himself for us and to us. He has promised to give us every heavenly blessing and every good thing that we need. If that's a perspective we have, if God is the ultimate person we go to find love and satisfaction, if God is the thing we ultimately desire, then we will not experience fear. Because God is faithful and never lets us down. But if we seek to find our joy, love, and satisfaction in temporary, earthly things, then our fears will only grow. So, we've seen that fear is necessary, that it's an emotion created by God to enable our survival, but also how fear can quickly overstep from its constructive usage and become unhealthy and limiting. And that's often through how we handle our thoughts, how we handle our emotions, or whether we view our lives through an eternal perspective. I don't know about you, but I have found myself experiencing fear in an unhealthy way through all of those ways at different points in my life. But thankfully, Jesus teaches us how to handle our fears when they threaten to overwhelm us. So next, we're going to have a look at Matthew's gospel account of Jesus walking on the water to help us learn how to handle our fears. And I'd love to encourage you all to open your heart and mind to receive this word afresh this morning. Some of you will be familiar with this story already, so you may be tempted to switch off, but I just really encourage you to let the Holy Spirit speak as those words are spoken. So it's Matthew 14, verses 22 to 33, and I'll be reading from the NIV. So immediately Jesus made the disciples get into the boat and go on ahead of him to the other side, while he had dismissed the crowd. After he had dismissed them, he went up on a mountainside by himself to pray. Later that night he was there alone, and the boat was already a considerable distance from the land, buffeted by the waves because the wind was against it. Shortly before dawn, Jesus went out to them, walking on the lake. When the disciples saw him walking on the lake, they were terrified. "It's a ghost," they said, and cried out in fear. But Jesus immediately said to them, "Take courage, it is I, don't be afraid." "Lord, if it is you," Peter replied, "tell me to come to you on the water." "Come," he said. Then Peter got down out of the boat, walked on the water, and came towards Jesus. But when he saw the wind, he was afraid, and beginning to sink, cried out, "Lord, save me." Immediately Jesus reached out his hand and caught him. "You of little faith," he said, "why did you doubt?" And when they climbed into the boat, the wind died down. Then those who were in the boat worshipped him, saying, "Truly you are the Son of God." Lovely. So the first point the passage makes is that life is full of things that we can be afraid of, which is a wonderful, cheery point, first point for us this morning. We're going to run through the passage I've just read and highlight to all of us the many things the disciples were afraid of. So we pick up in verse 22. Immediately Jesus made the disciples get into the boat. When it says Jesus made the disciples get into the boat, it actually means it. The Greek word for made means to compel someone to do something, often against their will. The Bible doesn't tell us why, but for whatever reason, Jesus thinks it's a really good idea for the disciples to leave straight away after feeding the 5,000. And then the passage tells us that disciples got themselves into a bit of trouble in the Sea of Galilee. So the Sea of Galilee, it's actually a really large lake, 13 by 8 miles, and it was known to experience dangerous weather conditions. And it seems like the disciples found themselves in stormy conditions, as the passage describes them being buffeted by the wind and the waves. The journey across that lake would usually take an hour, but the passage says that Jesus goes out to them just before dawn. And a more literal translation, like the ESV, uses the term the fourth watch of the night instead of just before dawn. And Romans in the time divided their night into 4 3-hour watches, so the fourth watch of the night would have been around 3 a.m. So the disciples had likely been rowing for 9 hours. That's 8 hours longer than they expected. So they're likely really tired physically and emotionally, and probably incredibly scared, as they've managed to get themselves stuck in this storm for many hours. Not only that, the disciples then see what they think is a ghost walking across the lake, and they're terrified. One of the superstitions at the time was that the souls of those who had drowned in the lake came up to haunt the waters at night, in particular those that were evil. So it's no surprise the disciples were terrified. And then to top it off, in ancient thought, the sea itself was seen to be a metaphorical and theological representation of chaos and disorder. So that's why in Revelation, in John's vision of the new heaven and the new earth, it says there'll be no sea. It's using a well-known biblical metaphor to say there'll be no chaos or disorder in the new heaven and the new earth. So the fact that they're stranded in the sea would have really filled them with dread. So in short, the disciples were terrified. Their situation was full of things that they could be afraid of. And as I've said earlier, this is often how we can feel today. There's so many things in our life that we can be afraid of. There's times when we feel compelled to do something for Jesus, but it ends up being really hard. Or times when the winds of life are against us and our circumstances are particularly challenging. Or other times when we're trying so hard to get through something, but we're just getting nowhere, or we keep getting blown off course. There's times when we're exhausted and knackered and we just don't seem to be catching a break. Or times when we are deeply out of control and things feel dark. Times where it seems like Jesus is nowhere to be found and we're full of doubt. We can resonate with this story because we all know what it's like to face storms in our lives. We all know what it's like to be afraid. And for me, one of the biggest, most persistent fears I have is around my health. I have a number of chronic health conditions and often find myself fearing that things will get worse. I'll have a flare-up, it'll limit my life. And being a doctor doesn't really help me, as I've seen just how bad things can get for people. But I wonder what it is for you. Perhaps it's a situation you're currently in that you don't know how you're going to get through. Or maybe it's the fear that you're not going to get something you want in life. Life is full of things that we can be afraid of. It can feel impossible to overcome all our fears. But Jesus provides us a way to overcome our fears. He gives us an answer to all the fears we face. So what is Jesus' answer to fear? Well, Jesus' first word to the disciples after they cry out in fear, exclaiming that they've seen a ghost, is verse 27. But Jesus immediately said to them, "Take courage, it is I, don't be afraid." And it's in that sentence that we find the answer to our fears. The phrase, "it is I," in the original language is ego ami, which is more literally translated as "I am." So Jesus more literally says to the disciples, "Take courage, I am, don't be afraid." And Jesus calling himself I am is really significant, as this is the divine name of God in the Old Testament. When Moses asked God at the burning bush, what should he call God? When Moses asked what God's name is, God replies by saying his name is I am. So Jesus is making a huge claim here when he uses the phrase I am to speak of himself. Jesus is declaring that he is God, and that is why we can take courage and not be afraid. And not only is Jesus claiming that he is God, but he is showing them too. And as I said earlier, the sea was a place of chaos and disorder. The Jews thought that only God could have command over the seas, over all the chaos and disorder. And we see it in the Bible. For instance, in the Old Testament, we see that God alone can tread on the waves of the sea. That's in Job. So the fact that Jesus can walk on the sea is huge, as only God can command the sea. So it demonstrates to the disciples that he is God. And the disciples at the time would have clocked onto what Jesus was saying and demonstrating here. And we can safely presume that Peter clocks onto the fact Jesus is saying he is God, as he responds with verse 28, "Lord, if it's you," Peter replied, "tell me to come to you on the water." And the word Lord in Greek can mean just master, but the word was also frequently used to refer to Jesus as God, as he is Lord of all. So it's likely that Peter has recognized at this moment that Jesus is God. And at the end of the story, verse 33, it says, "Then those who were in the boat worshipped him, saying, 'Truly you are the Son of God.'" So it can't get clearer than that. We know the disciples realized in this moment that Jesus is God. But knowing that Jesus is God is not just something for the disciples to recognize back then, it's something Matthew, the gospel writer, wants readers like us today to notice. The phrase, "I am," take courage, I am, don't be afraid, is bang in the center of the walking on the water story. And the story itself is in the center of Matthew's gospel. So Matthew is really trying to emphasize this line to us. He really wants his readers, people like us today, to know that Jesus is God. Jesus is not just a good teacher or a powerful prophet, but he is God. And as a result, he is the answer to all of our fears. The answer to our fears that Jesus gives us all is to know that Jesus is God. Because if Jesus is God, then it changes everything. If we believe Jesus is God and he tells us not to fear, then that is huge. That's much more significant than a friend, a parent, a partner, or a leader telling us not to fear. Because God is God. He's so much more able than any human. He creates everything, he sustains everything, and he'll bring it to completion. He has rescued us out of love and promises to be with us. He promises to work for the good of all that love him. He is King and Lord over the earth. He has power, control, majesty, and might. So when God tells us not to fear, we really don't have to fear, because he is who he says he is and has the power, wisdom, and control to change things. Everything is in his hands, and he loves us, and he wants what's best for us. If we believe Jesus is God, then we have no reason to be afraid. Jesus is God is the answer to all of our fears. And this brings us to the heart of why we fear. The presence of fear in our lives often reflects how we view God and our trust towards him. If we view God as present, loving, sovereign, working in all things to bring good, then we have no reason to be afraid. But if we view God with any uncertainty or unbelief that God is always acting in a good way towards us, then we will experience fear. At the heart of fear is whether we trust God or not. And the problem is, it can be really hard for us to trust God in our society. In a society that encourages us to see our life as knowable, predictable, and within our control. We're to take control of our lives and our destinies so that nothing bad happens to us and we've got nothing to be afraid of. We're told that we can have it all and control our lives to exclude all suffering. We're essentially told that we're to trust in ourselves and not in God for the life we want. But that's just not the reality of the world we live in. You guys will know that. We just don't have control. Apparently, the average person in the West has control of about 15% of their life. And if you try really, really hard, you might be able to get that up to 17, but it's not a lot. So we really don't have much control. We can't control our bodies, other people, our environment, our experiences, meaning suffering is just part of life in a fallen world. It's not something we can avoid. And because of this shortfall in our control, we harbour fears, anxiety, and worry. We fear what could be and run through all the possible negative outcomes. And anxiety and worry and fear consumes us. So at the heart of fear is a lack of trust in God. We try to trust ourselves instead of him. We think that we know what's best for us, not God. We think we can control our lives to make it the best it could be, and we don't trust God's vision, guidance, or input. We forget that God is in fact the most generous host who has created us, loves us, provides, rescues, and cares for us, who works in all things for our good, even if it doesn't seem good to us at the time, and wants us to trust him in all things. So the answer to fear is Jesus is God. He is God, and we are not. For us to be able to let go of fear, we have to entrust our life to him. We have to see the world through the lens of God's kingdom and trust that he is a good and faithful God who loves us. And I think many of us today, we need to remember that Jesus is God. With the many fears, anxieties, worries that we're facing, perhaps we're struggling financially and really need God to provide. Or perhaps we're struggling in a certain relationship that's full of tension and pain. Whatever it might be, whether it's our health, finances, relationships, children, job, housing, we have to reorient our minds and resurrender our hearts to him. He is God and we are not, and that is a very, very good thing. So we know the answer to our fears is Jesus is God. So what's our response? What should our response be to knowing and grasping that Jesus is God as the answer to our fears? And the passage shows us that our response should be one of faith. And in some senses, I've already covered this. If the heart of fear is a lack of trust in Jesus as God, then our response has to be one of trust. And trust and faith are very similar concepts. But the passage has more to say about it. In particular, it provides a really relatable example for us, which is worth us exploring. So let's just read the relevant part of the passage again. So Jesus has told his disciples not to be afraid because he is I am. And then verse 28 onwards. Lord, if it's you, Peter replied, tell me to come to you on the water. Come, he said. Then Peter got down out of the boat, walked on the water and came towards Jesus. But when he saw the wind, he was afraid and beginning to sink, cried out, Lord, save me. Immediately Jesus reached out his hand and caught him. You of little faith, he said, why did you doubt? Peter's response here demonstrates our experience of faith so well. Peter, battling with his fears and doubts, has a moment of boldness and courage where he reacts in faith and asks Jesus to call him out in the waters. It could have been seen as a slightly impulsive request, but it's one of faith nonetheless, and potentially a lot more faith than you and I have. I'm not sure if any of you have walked on water. I definitely haven't. So he gets out the boat, walks on the water towards Jesus, but then he sees the wind and the waves and he becomes overwhelmed by fear and cries out to Jesus to save him. He must have got pretty close to Jesus as Jesus is just able to reach out and catch him. And I believe this experience represents our faith journeys so well. Life throws so much at us. Things are often really challenging. And in that we are so easily overcome by our fears. But we know and experience Jesus in our day-to-day lives, so we respond to him in faith, willing to step out for him in our families, workplaces, neighbourhoods and cities. But then sometimes our circumstances, the reactions of those around us, our perceived impossibility of the task at hand, our inexperience draws us to doubt and we melt back into our fears. We see the wind and the waves and our faith and our trust falters. But even in our fear, we express some faith. Peter cries out to Jesus when he begins to feel himself sink, Lord, save me. And I think it's often can be the same for us today. In those moments of feeling utterly overwhelmed by our fears and our circumstances, we manage a weak cry of, Jesus, help me, demonstrating our faith even through our fears. And this story of Peter battling fear and faith, doubt and belief, it's incredibly relatable to us. It's often our day-to-day experience of our lives. We have faith, but also unbelief. We have courage, but also fear. And I think this story is here in the centre of Matthew's Gospel to bring huge encouragement to weary followers of Jesus. Life is hard. We can choose to respond in faith, and all that is required of us is faith as small as a mustard seed, because that's all Jesus needs to rescue us. And we see this in verse 31, which shows us Jesus' response to Peter. Immediately, Jesus reached out his hand and caught him. "You of little faith," he said, "why did you doubt?" So immediately, Jesus reaches out and catches Peter. In our moments of fear, faltering faith, and failure, Jesus is there ready to catch us. He's there ready and waiting for us to turn to him with what little faith we can muster. And then Jesus says to Peter, "You of little faith, why did you doubt?" In our translations today, we can easily read that as an insult. But most scholars think the phrase, "you of little faith," is best read as a loving parental correction. So it was as if Jesus was saying, "Peter, you were so close. I was right here. I'm God. I am able. Why did you doubt me, my son?" Jesus wants us to be people who respond to him in faith, and he knows we find it hard, so he's there to catch us whenever we may begin to falter. And that's Jesus' posture and word to us this morning, in whatever circumstances we may be facing, whether we're in a place of fear and doubt or faith and courage. He invites us to put our faith and trust in him afresh, to look beyond our circumstances, whatever weather pattern we may find ourselves in, however big the storm and the waves might be, to let go of the little control that we might have, and to trust him and to say yes to him, as he is abundantly able, immensely loving, and works things out for our good. As he alone controls the storms of our life and enables his followers to do the impossible, so that our fears diminished, so that we're freed from our fears and able to live in peace and ease with our circumstances. And this is an ongoing journey for us. It's highly unlikely that after hearing this talk and experiencing the Spirit this morning, that you'll never fear again. And also just to say, it's important that we seek support from doctors and take whatever medication we may be on if we're suffering from a mental health condition that causes us to fear, as often that's part of our journey of healing. For all of us, Jesus takes us on journeys to become fearless disciples. He works in our lives and heart through our circumstances to help us increasingly walk in a place where we're free of fear. And we see this in the Bible. The passage we're looking at today isn't the first storm the disciples have encountered with Jesus. The first storm story in Matthew's Gospel is in chapter 8, where Jesus is asleep in the boat when they're caught up in this storm. And in that story, Jesus asks his disciples, "Why are you so afraid?" But then in the storm passage we've looked at today, Jesus is out of the boat and nowhere to be found. And when he sees his disciples reacting in fear, he says to them, "Don't be afraid." So you can sort of see the progression in these stories. In the first storm story, Jesus is with them in the boat. In the second story, Jesus is nowhere to be found. In the first storm story, Jesus asks them, "Why are you so afraid?" In the second story, Jesus commands them, "Don't be afraid." What it shows us is that early on in our faith journeys, Jesus tests our faith more gently and doesn't command us not to be afraid. But as we experience more of Jesus, as we mature, he starts to test our faith in greater ways and reminds us that fear is ultimately a lack of faith. So just as he did with the disciples back then, he takes us on a journey now through the ups and downs of life, and particularly through the storms. By doing so, Jesus is trying to teach us and form us into a fear-free people. It's less about arriving, but more about moving forward. We may never be completely fear-free before Jesus returns, but we can become increasingly fear-free as we follow him. So wherever you are on the journey today, Jesus invites you to take this next step. Jesus knows that we face many fears in our life, and he invites us to surrender it all to him, to let go of control. No matter the storms we're facing in our circumstances, whether it's relational, financial, health, or situational pressures, he invites us to know that he is God, to trust him and respond in faith, saying yes to him and all that he asks of us, allowing our fears to diminish so that we can be a fear-free people. So if you're able, would you like to stand? We're just going to take a moment to just invite the Holy Spirit. You might want to posture your arms in sort of a receiving position, close your eyes, and just focus on Jesus. So yeah, Father, we just invite you. Come, Holy Spirit. Come, Holy Spirit. Come, Jesus. As I was praying for this talk this week, really got the sense that the Lord wants to meet us all in our fears. I really felt the Lord meeting me recently in mine. As I said earlier, one of my biggest fears is my health, and I've really felt the Lord meet me there, speaking to me, saying, that verse, my grace is sufficient for you, my power is made perfect in weakness. And He's helped me realise that through some of my health battles, there's a dependency and a surrender that He's worked in me. And that's a really powerful thing, and God's power can manifest in that. So this week I've been starting to feel almost a sense of gladness over some of the health struggles that I've had. Of course, I'm still praying for healing, but yeah, I've been feeling a sense of gratitude for Him working in me and through that. And I still have ill health, but I feel deeply reassured of His presence and His love and His purpose. And I just feel that the Lord, that's not just for me, that's for the rest of us this morning. Whatever fear you may be carrying, whether it's fear of failure or not meeting people's expectations or missing out on God's plan of your life, fear of change or rejection, not being good enough, fear of not getting married or not having kids, fear of ill health or death. Yeah, I really feel that the Lord wants to meet us in that place, that He really wants to minister to us in our fears, whatever they may be. So yeah, I really feel that's one of the first things that God wants to do this morning. So we're just going to take a moment to respond to that first, and then we'll see what else the Lord wants to do. So if you're in a place of fear, if there's a fear that you know has gripped your heart, however big, however small, whatever it may be, and you just want the Lord to minister to you in His power and His presence, in His love and His truth, and bring His freedom, He can do that. I just invite you guys to start coming forward, to make space. There's loads of space here at the front, because I just really trust that the Lord will meet us in our fears. He wants to free us. So yeah, if that is you, please do come forward.